The year was 1868, and the air in Helena, Montana, hung heavy with the smell of pine and desperation. Inside a rough-hewn clinic, barely more than a shack, Reverend Thomas stood over a makeshift cot. He was new to this raw, sprawling town, his clean-pressed suit a stark contrast to the dust-caked miners who shuffled through its streets. Before him, a young man, Elias, lay broken. His leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, a gruesome sight that spoke of a recent mine collapse. Elias's face was pale, streaked with dirt and sweat, his eyes glazed with pain. He was barely conscious, but as his gaze flickered up to the pastor, a desperate plea escaped his lips, raspy and weak. "Pastor, please, pray for me. Pray for my soul." It wasn't medicine he asked for, not a doctor's skilled hand, but something far deeper, something that spoke of fear and the unknown. Just then, the clinic door swung open with a bang, letting in a gust of cold air and a figure that seemed to embody the harshness of the frontier. Silas, an older miner, grizzled and hard-faced, stomped in. He was known for his sharp tongue and a cynicism that cut deeper than any pickaxe. He surveyed the scene, his eyes landing on Elias, then on Reverend Thomas. A loud scoff broke the silence. "Prayer? What good is that, boy? You're as good as done. Best save your breath for something useful." As if to underscore his contempt, Silas spat on the dirt floor, the dark phlegm landing disturbingly close to Elias's head. It was a deliberate act meant to degrade, to show his utter disregard for the suffering man and the pastor's quiet presence. Reverend Thomas didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice or even change the calm expression on his face. Instead, he simply bent down, picked up a clean, if somewhat worn, cloth from a nearby table. With a slow, deliberate motion, he used it to wipe away the spittle from the floor. Then, with a tenderness that seemed out of place in such a brutal setting, he folded the cloth and gently placed it under Elias's head, offering a small measure of comfort. His gaze, as he straightened up, was quiet, but it held an unwavering resolve. It was a look that promised a reckoning, not with anger or violence, but with a quiet strength that felt almost more intimidating. Silas, momentarily taken aback by the pastor's unexpected composure, actually stumbled backward slightly. It was as if he'd been struck by an invisible force, not a physical blow, but something that rattled his usual bravado. A hushed silence fell over the small room, broken only by Elias's shallow breathing. "Some wounds are not of the flesh, but of the spirit," Reverend Thomas murmured, his voice low but resonating with an unshakable conviction. It wasn't a challenge, but a statement of truth, delivered with a quiet authority that seemed to fill the cramped space. Silas, his usual bluster deflated for a moment, glared at the pastor, then his eyes flickered to Elias, a twisted mix of disdain and something close to unease on his face. He muttered something under his breath, indecipherable but clearly hostile, before turning abruptly and storming out of the clinic. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving the air crackling with unspoken tension. The quiet defiance of the pastor hung in the air, a challenge issued without a single raised voice. It left everyone in the room, and anyone watching, to wonder what this quiet act would ignite in the days to come. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Reverend Thomas had come to Helena expecting a challenge, but nothing could have truly prepared him for the raw, untamed reality of this burgeoning mining town. He had left behind a quiet parish in New England, a place of neat rows of houses, predictable seasons, and a community steeped in tradition. Helena, in the year 1868, was a different beast entirely. It was a place forged in the crucible of ambition and desperation, a magnet for fortune seekers from every corner of the globe. The town itself was a chaotic tapestry of makeshift wooden structures, hastily erected to serve the endless pursuit of gold. Saloons outnumbered churches by a wide margin, their raucous laughter and piano music spilling out into the dusty streets at all hours. The air was thick with the scent of pine, wood smoke, and the ever-present dust kicked up by wagons and horses. Lawlessness wasn't just a threat, it was often the default state, with disputes settled more often by fists or firearms than by any formal justice. Yet, amidst the grime and the greed, there was also an undeniable undercurrent of raw hope, a belief that just one more swing of the pickaxe could change everything. It was a place of extremes, where fortunes were made and lost in a single day, and life itself felt perpetually on the edge. Reverend Thomas was a man of deep, unwavering faith, but he was far from naive. His upbringing had instilled in him a strong moral compass, a belief in the inherent good that resided within every human being, even when it was buried under layers of hardship and cynicism. He carried a quiet strength, a gentle persistence that had served him well in his previous life. However, beneath that calm exterior, a quiet vulnerability lingered. He often found himself questioning if his ideals, born in the relative peace of New England, could truly take root in such harsh, unyielding soil. He doubted his own ability to make a real difference in a place where survival often seemed to be the only creed. His dream was to build a community founded not on gold but on compassion, shared values, and mutual respect. He envisioned a place where people looked out for one another, where the desperate scramble for wealth didn't overshadow the need for human connection. This vision stood in stark contrast to the cutthroat reality of the mining camps, where trust was a luxury few could afford. Silas was a living embodiment of that reality. He was a fixture in the Helena mining community, a man whose features had been etched by years of grueling labor, his spirit hardened by countless dashed hopes. His cynicism wasn't just a personality trait, it was a shield, a protective layer built up over a lifetime of disappointments. His cruelty, often delivered with a sneer and a sharp word, served as a defense mechanism, keeping others at a distance, ensuring he wouldn't be hurt again. He represented the disillusioned spirit of the frontier, a stark foil to the pastor's idealism. Silas had seen too much, lost too much, to believe in anything as intangible as faith or community. For him, the world was a dog-eat-dog place, and he intended to be the one doing the biting. Their paths, though not yet directly confrontational in a grand sense, were already intertwining, their opposing philosophies set to clash in the dusty streets of Helena. The incident in the clinic was just the first spark. Silas's sneering presence had already started to wear down the rough-hewn fabric of the Helena community, and Reverend Thomas felt its effects chipping away at his initial optimism. The pastor had arrived with a heart full of hope, but the constant low hum of discord, often traced back to Silas, was a relentless drain. It wasn't just the big, dramatic clashes, it was the everyday meanness, the way Silas seemed to delight in tearing things down. There were countless stories, small bitter pills swallowed by the community. Flashbacks to earlier days in Helena showed Silas exploiting younger, less experienced miners. He would promise them a fair share of a promising claim, his words smooth and convincing, only to deliver meager returns once the hard work was done. The new arrivals, fresh off the stagecoach with stars in their eyes, would work themselves to exhaustion, dreaming of gold, while Silas would pocket the lion's share. His explanations always just plausible enough to avoid outright accusation. He had a knack for bending the truth until it suited him. Beyond the financial exploitation, Silas found a twisted pleasure in public humiliation. Reverend Thomas particularly remembered a Sunday service he had tried to hold in a hastily converted saloon. He had spoken of humility and shared burdens. During his sermon, Silas had stood near the back, openly mocking a miner who had quietly confessed to feeling overwhelmed and lonely. "Prayer won't fill your pockets, boy," Silas had yelled, his voice laced with venom, drawing snickers from a few of his cronies. The young miner, his face red with shame, had slunk out, and the fragile sense of reverence Reverend Thomas had tried to build shattered like glass. Silas seemed to target anyone who showed weakness or expressed any form of vulnerability, especially if it happened during one of the pastor's attempts to bring people together. Silas was a master of manipulation, always finding a way to twist situations to his advantage, almost always at the expense of others. He was a whisperer of rumors, planting seeds of doubt and suspicion among the miners. He would suggest that one man was holding out on a good find, or that another was cheating at cards, knowing full well that in such a tense environment, these rumors could quickly ignite into arguments and even fights. He actively undermined any attempts at collective good within the mining camps, seeing cooperation as a weakness, a foolish notion that only benefited the naive. Reverend Thomas had seen him hoard essential supplies during a particularly harsh winter, when the snowdrifts were chest-high and the trails impassable. Silas had bought up blankets, flour, and coffee, then watched as prices soared, profiting from the desperate need of his neighbors. When confronted, he would simply shrug, claiming it was just good business. a harsh lesson for those who hadn't planned ahead. This behavior, while condemned by many, was often tolerated in 1860s Helena. There was a glaring lack of formal law enforcement, and the prevailing every man for himself mentality meant that people often looked the other way, too busy trying to survive themselves. The community was still forming, a rough draft of civilization, and Silas thrived in this chaotic liminal space where rules were suggestions and self-interest often reigned supreme. The pastor had watched, his heart heavy, as Silas's actions slowly eroded trust and fostered a deep-seated resentment among the miners. Elias's injury and Silas's utterly callous reaction in the clinic wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a long, painful history of disrespect, cruelty, and exploitation. It was a final, unbearable insult that pushed the boundaries of what Reverend Thomas could tolerate. Elias's desperate plea for prayer, met with Silas's spitting contempt, was the last straw, a clear sign that something had to change. The emotional atmosphere in Helena became heavier and more unsustainable with each passing day. Reverend Thomas's attempts to build a community based on compassion and shared values met with increasing resistance, mostly because of Silas. Silas's influence was like a persistent, cold wind that swept through the camp, chilling any warmth the pastor tried to create. Arguments broke out more often, not just in the boisterous saloons, but even in the quieter mining camps. What started as whispers of discontent about the pastor's soft ways turned into open arguments. Silas was always there, a shadowy figure working to undo everything Reverend Thomas tried to do. He would mock the pastor's sermons, making jokes about faith and charity, sometimes even during the services themselves. He actively discouraged people from attending, making them feel foolish for seeking solace or guidance. He spread rumors about the pastor's intentions, suggesting he was only there to collect money or gain power, twisting every good deed into something suspicious. The social pressure on Reverend Thomas grew intense. Some miners who had initially shown support started to keep their distance. They were afraid of Silas's anger and the trouble he could stir up. Others just seemed tired of the constant fighting. They longed for peace, even if it meant ignoring the injustices around them. Silas, seeing his power grow, became more aggressive. His words were sharper, more cutting, and his actions became bolder. He even started organizing his own gatherings, timing them to clash with church services. He would encourage gambling and heavy drinking, trying to pull people away from the pastor's message and into his own world of excess. Reverend Thomas felt the weight of judgment from all sides. The traditionalists thought he was too gentle, not tough enough for the frontier. The cynics dismissed his faith as naive, a weakness in a world that rewarded strength. Even some well-meaning folks who just wanted quiet wished he would stop stirring things up. He felt a deep sense of emotional suffocation, like the air was being slowly squeezed out of him. He was isolated in his mission, standing alone against a tide of cynicism and self-interest. This period marked the greatest emotional strain he had experienced since arriving in Helena. He remembered one evening after trying to mediate a dispute between two miners over a claim, a dispute Silas had clearly fanned. He had walked back to his small cabin, the dust of the trail clinging to his boots and clothes, feeling completely drained. He tried to tell himself that progress was slow, that change took time, but the image of Elias, broken and bleeding, haunted him, along with Silas's cruel sneer. He wondered if he was truly making a difference, or if he was just a naive fool trying to plant flowers in a desert. The constant need to defend his intentions, to explain the simple tenets of kindness and mutual respect, wore him down. Every small victory felt temporary, easily erased by Silas's next cynical remark or manipulative act. He saw the doubt in people's eyes, the way they looked from him to Silas, weighing their options, choosing the path of least resistance. He understood their fear, but it didn't make the isolation any easier. He had come to Helena with a clear vision, a dream of building a spiritual home, but that dream felt fragile, constantly threatened by the harsh realities of the frontier. He prayed more intensely during these days, not just for the community, but for his own strength, for the resilience to keep pushing forward despite the overwhelming odds. He knew something had to break, that this tension couldn't last forever. The constant pressure and the gnawing doubt reached a breaking point. Reverend Thomas, visiting Elias in his small, cramped cabin, found him marginally better, though still weak. The miner's leg was bandaged crudely, and a fever still flickered in his eyes. Elias had been drifting in and out, but this day, a moment of startling clarity pierced through the pain. "Pastor," Elias whispered, his voice dry and barely audible. "It wasn't an accident." "Not completely." Reverend Thomas leaned closer, his heart seizing in his chest. He had assumed, like everyone else, that it was a terrible mining mishap, common in these dangerous shafts. But the way Elias said it, the desperate urgency in his gaze, told him otherwise. "What do you mean, Elias?" he asked, keeping his voice calm, trying not to startle the injured man. Elias swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the small room as if Silas himself might be listening. "Silas," he rasped. He loosened the supports, the timbers in that section, said I was digging too close to his claim, warned me. A cold dread washed over Reverend Thomas. He felt a sickening lurch in his stomach. It wasn't just a cruel man, a cynical bully. This was deliberate, malicious sabotage. Elias's accident, the mangled leg, the pain, the near-death experience, it was all a result of Silas's calculated evil. He had not just threatened Elias's livelihood, he had tried to take his life, all for a bit of gold. The revelation hit Reverend Thomas like a physical blow. His initial belief in human redemption, his unwavering hope that even the hardest hearts could be softened by faith, fractured. He had seen Silas's cruelty, his greed, his manipulation, but this was a new, darker layer. It transformed Silas from a mere antagonist, a man shaped by the harsh frontier, into a truly malevolent force, a predator who would intentionally harm others for personal gain. He sat there, the air thick with Elias's shallow breaths, the smell of liniment and fear. The pastor's quiet resolve, which had been tested and strained, now hardened into something fierce and unyielding. He could no longer stand by. He could not allow this evil to fester, to continue destroying lives in Helena. This wasn't just about Elias anymore. It was about the very soul of the town, about drawing a line against unchecked depravity. He looked at Elias, a young man whose dreams had been shattered by another's malice. "Thank you for telling me, Elias," he said, his voice low but firm. "You did the right thing." Even as he spoke, Reverend Thomas felt a shift within himself. The quiet, contemplative pastor who had arrived in Helena, hoping to gently guide a community, was gone. In his place was a man ready for battle, a man who understood that sometimes faith demanded direct confrontation. An unexpected opportunity then presented itself. News spread through town that a meeting was being called. The recent spate of mining accidents, coupled with the general lawlessness that seemed to be growing unchecked, had finally forced the town's informal leaders to act. Silas, ever the opportunist, was already planning to use this meeting to his advantage. He would undoubtedly blame the accidents on recklessness, on poor mining practices, subtly shifting blame away from himself and consolidating his power. He would likely present himself as the voice of reason, the man who understood the harsh realities of the mines. But Reverend Thomas knew better. This meeting, intended to discuss the town's problems, would become the stage. It would be the moment to confront Silas directly, publicly, to rip away his mask of respectability and expose his true, malevolent nature. This was it. This was the moment that would irrevocably break the cycle of suffering and shift the narrative of Helena one way or another. He would not let Silas control the story any longer. The town hall meeting had erupted into chaos. Reverend Thomas, standing firm before the restless crowd, had laid bare Silas's treachery, detailing Elias's accusation with a calm, unwavering voice. The immediate aftermath was a maelstrom of shouts, gasps, and conflicting voices. Some miners, their faces grim, nodded in agreement, a few even stepping forward, their own suppressed grievances bubbling to the surface. Others, however, were quick to condemn the pastor. "Slander!" bellowed a burly man, his face red with indignation. "You're a man of God, Reverend, not a judge. You have no proof." "He's just trying to stir up trouble," shouted another, his eyes darting nervously towards the back of the room where Silas, eyes blazing, stood surrounded by his usual cronies. "Mind your own business, preacher, or go back to where you came from." The accusations hit Reverend Thomas hard. He felt the weight of their doubts, the raw fear in their voices, and the shame some tried to cast upon him. He was accused of overstepping his pastoral duties, of bringing discord rather than peace. The very foundation of his mission felt like it was crumbling under the pressure. Yet he refused to yield. Elias's broken leg, his whispered confession, was a constant burning reminder of the truth. The confrontation had indeed unleashed a torrent of pent-up emotions from the community. Years of Silas's subtle manipulations, his broken promises, and his outright bullying had created a pressure cooker in Helena. Now, with the lid blown off, stories spilled out. A young prospector, barely more than a boy, tearfully recounted how Silas had cheated him out of his claim, threatening him with violence if he spoke up. An older miner, his hands gnarled from years of labor, described how Silas had hoarded supplies during a harsh winter, selling them back at exorbitant prices. Each new testimony added fuel to the fire, but it also intensified the backlash from Silas's allies and those who simply wanted the unrest to cease. Amidst the clamor, a surprising figure emerged as an unexpected ally. Martha, the owner of the Golden Nugget Saloon, a woman known for her sharp wit and a kindness she usually kept well hidden, stepped forward. Her voice, though not loud, cut through the din with an authority born of years observing human nature in her establishment. "I've seen Silas at work," Martha stated, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "He preys on the weak, profits from fear. Elias isn't the first, and he won't be the last if we let this continue." She then looked directly at Reverend Thomas, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. Later, she would offer him a quiet corner in her saloon, a place away from prying eyes, and share crucial information she had gathered over the years about Silas's illicit dealings, details that would prove invaluable. Conversely, a prominent and wealthy merchant, Mr. Abernathy, a man whose business dealings were often intertwined with Silas's, publicly condemned the pastor. "This is an outrage," Abernathy declared, his voice booming with self-importance. "You are disrupting the fragile peace of our town, Reverend. We need stability, not these baseless accusations. Think of our economy, our future." He feared disruption, not justice. The cultural dynamics of 1868 Helena heavily influenced these reactions. Frontier justice, while often rough and ready, was still a powerful force. Reputation meant everything, and the struggle between lawlessness and the yearning for order played out in every corner of the town. Reverend Thomas, caught in the middle, experienced intense psychological pressure. He questioned his own judgment, the wisdom of his actions, and even the very foundation of his faith. Was he doing more harm than good? Was he truly serving God or simply inviting more chaos? Yet, despite the doubts that gnawed at him, he refused to yield. The faces of Elias and the other victims flashed in his mind. He had made a promise, not just to Elias, but to himself and to the ideals he believed in. He would not let Silas win. This battle was far from over. Reverend Thomas, though bruised by the accusations and the weight of the community's division, began the slow, arduous process of reestablishing himself. The initial dismissal of the testimonies against Silas started to crumble. Inspired by the pastor's unwavering stance, more individuals who had previously been too afraid to speak now stepped forward. Their voices, though hesitant at first, grew stronger with each shared story of Silas's treachery. Martha, true to her word, provided crucial evidence. She had kept meticulous, if unofficial, records of Silas's shady dealings, the inflated prices, the rigged card games, and the subtle ways he had manipulated property claims. Her saloon, a hub of information and gossip, had given her an unparalleled view into the darker corners of Helena's economy. She presented these details to a small, newly formed committee of concerned citizens, giving their accusations a solid foundation. The weight of evidence, combined with the turning tide of public sentiment, finally began to crush Silas. He had relied on fear and intimidation for too long, and now that fear was slowly transforming into outrage. Facing not just public disgrace, but also the very real possibility of charges for sabotage and other crimes, Silas knew his time in Helena was over. He made a desperate attempt to flee, hoping to disappear into the vast, untamed wilderness. But the community, having finally found its courage, was not about to let him escape so easily. A hastily formed vigilante committee, a common form of frontier justice in those days, apprehended him as he tried to sneak out of town under the cover of darkness. They didn't kill him. Reverend Thomas had quietly but firmly argued against such an extreme measure, appealing to their sense of a nascent justice. Instead, Silas was publicly disgraced and banished from Helena, stripped of all his claims and influence. He was warned that if he ever returned, the consequences would be far more severe. He left Helena a broken man, his arrogance replaced by a bitter shame, a stark contrast to the powerful figure he once was. Elias, though permanently scarred by his injury and the ordeal, began a slow but steady recovery. The pastor's unwavering support and the community's eventual embrace were crucial to healing his spirit. He would never mine again, but with the help of the town, he found new purpose, teaching children what little he knew of reading and writing and sharing stories of his youth. Reverend Thomas, having faced his own doubts and emerged stronger, dedicated himself to building a more just and compassionate Helena. He understood that his initial dream had been naive but not entirely wrong. He established a proper church, a simple wooden structure that quickly became a focal point for the community. A rudimentary school soon followed, and he tirelessly advocated for a more formal justice system, pushing for the appointment of a circuit judge and the establishment of a town council. Helena, though still rough around the edges, slowly began to shed its lawless skin. The story concluded with Reverend Thomas reflecting on the journey. He stood before his small but growing congregation, looking out at faces that had once been hardened by cynicism and fear, now softened by hope and community. He understood that justice on the frontier was often messy and hard-won, a slow, painful process of chipping away at ignorance and cruelty. But he also realized that even in the most desolate places, faith, courage, and a collective will to do good could triumph over the darkest of human impulses. The prayer Elias had asked for that day in the makeshift clinic, "Pray for my soul," was not just for his own salvation. It was, in a profound way, a prayer for the soul of the entire community, for Helena itself. And in the unwavering resolve he had shown in the community he had helped build, Reverend Thomas had, in his own quiet way, answered it.